Alrighty, hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to session number 2 of the 21st Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. NWILL's land acknowledgement was read at our opening session and will be read again at our closing session. To view the land acknowledgement, please take a visit to our website at nwill.org under the land acknowledgement tab. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat right now within Whova for anyone who wants to take a look at the full statement. Today's date is Thursday, September 8th. This session is titled No ILL Will, Cross-Train to Smooth Interlibrary Loan Workflows, and will be presented by Rusty Tryon, Kirsten Williams, and Kristen Burkholder. My name is Leanna Pagano, and I am the convener for this session. As a reminder, this session is being recorded with permission from the presenters. Because they retain the copyright to the information they are presenting, they may choose to request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to the NWILL Community Chairperson. However, at this time, it's planned that recordings will be made available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn on live recording, click on the CC link at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitles. If you want to expand your screen, please use the double arrow at the upper right corner of your viewing window. When the presentation ends, please complete the post-session survey in Whova. It's also located on the conference homepage. NWILL and presenters will appreciate any and all feedback that you get. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the session over to our presenters.
All right, thank you. So I am Rusty Tryon. I'm the director of the Rooney Library at St. Mary of the Woods College in St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. And so to start off our presentation, I'm going to offer a very broad, simple overview of interlibrary loan that's really meant to help you to begin to think about how to talk about, and probably more so, market interlibrary loan work to other employees in your library to potentially recruit them for cross-training to work in interlibrary loan. So these topics that I'm going to present are really kind of the big picture work of interlibrary loan. And in fact, each point on each slide could probably be its own presentation at this conference. And so for those who are not currently working in interlibrary loan or are very new to interlibrary loan, I hope that this broad overview gives you a better understanding of how interlibrary loan connects to your particular area if you're not already in interlibrary loan. Next slide, please. So the Rooney Library employs one full-time librarian, myself, and one adjunct librarian who works for us during the fall and spring semesters. We have about 8 student workers who work during the semester as well. And I work with interlibrary loan as well as our adjunct librarian and one student worker. And while I work in both borrowing and lending, the adjunct librarian and certainly our student worker focus mostly just on lending. We've been using Tapasa as our interlibrary loan management system since December of 2020. And last academic year, we processed just over 10,000 interlibrary loan transactions. Next slide. So although there are formal definitions of interlibrary loan, at its core, interlibrary loan borrowing is simply getting materials that are not in your own collections from other libraries for your users. And so you'll see there I've listed some policy questions, and you may be thinking, well, how can I use policies to talk about interlibrary loan and share it with others? Well, I think policies really undergird the services that we offer and the processes that we use in interlibrary loan so much. And so they're important to know these policies. And it's likely that these are the questions that our patrons will have and that they'll ask us. So it's important that we're familiar with the basic answers to these policy questions. In terms of who may request items through interlibrary loan at your library. So typically, these will be users who are affiliated with your institution or are registered with your library. And then you'll want to consider any demographics that you want to capture about those users. So for us in my library, we think about their academic status. So are they an undergraduate student, a faculty member, and we also consider their academic department. And then will users of different status be treated differently? So will interlibrary loan services for undergraduate students look different from what you offer to faculty, and how? And then we also here in our institution consider how to provide interlibrary loan services to our distance learners. In terms of what requests are generally placed into two broad categories. So we think of returnables or loans and non-returnables or copies, articles, scans, any other descriptor for non-returnables. And so returnables, as the name implies, are items that you will send back to the supplying library after their use, and non-returnables are items that the user may keep. You also want to consider what types of materials that users may request and types of materials they may not request. So for example, here at our library, students are not permitted to request textbooks through interlibrary loan. When? So how long will your user accept to receive an item? So their need by date, their default need by date for us is 30 days, but they can change that. How long does it take to receive a copy or a loan? How long may items that are returnables be kept? Are renewals a possibility? And so while some of those latter questions aren't determined by you as the borrowing library, you as the borrowing library should be aware of lenders who are the most generous with loan periods. In terms of where for borrowing, so where will you go to seek and obtain those needed items? Are there partnerships you should consider, consortia, other agreements that will factor into your decision making? Have you used data to determine who your reliable and quick providers are? And then will you ship items that you receive to distance students? The why of borrowing is pretty simple, and that is that no library can purchase everything that their users would potentially want or need. And so we rely on borrowing to obtain those materials. And then finally, how I kind of frame it in the question of how much. So how much are you willing to pay to obtain the materials that your users need? And then will your users pay for those fees in part or in full? How will you handle costs associated with copyright and other fees for borrowing materials? And what mechanisms will you use to pay for all of those? Next slide, please. So here's a very basic rendering of the process of borrowing. So initially, you'll receive that request from the user via some mechanism, email, a form through your interlibrary loan system, and then you'll verify the details of that request. And so an accurate citation is essential for processing borrowing requests quickly and efficiently. And it's also important to verify if your library owns material that's being requested through borrowing. Then that request will be submitted to potential lenders. You'll receive that request back from a library, and then you'll supply that item on to the user. And in the case of returnables, you'll close out that request by returning that item back to the supplying library. So I think interlibrary loan intersects with reference or research services or whatever you call it at your library, and circulation and collection development most immediately in terms of borrowing. So it's likely that reference staff are going to be the ones who direct users to use interlibrary loan to obtain materials that they discovered in their research. Circulation staff will engage with users when they come to obtain physical materials. And then interlibrary loan staff should work with collection development to fill in gaps in the collections that are revealed through interlibrary loan borrowing activity. And I also think that borrowing is where interlibrary loan shines. So I think we all have our librarian superhero stories to share about getting that really hard to find resource for a researcher. And really persistence is truly a virtue when it comes to borrowing work in interlibrary loan. So now we transition to lending basics. So whereas borrowing is about getting from, lending is really about supplying items from your own collections to other libraries when they're requested. So the basic questions are the same, but of course the answers will differ. So in terms of who, to whom will you lend materials, and to whom will you not lend materials? So will you lend items to international libraries? If so, which ones, which not? And then are there certain libraries or groups of libraries that you'll prioritize in your lending workflows? What will you send and what will you not lend? So older items, newer items, rare items like theses and dissertations. Do licensing terms restrict what and how you lend some materials that are part of your digital collections? So how quickly can you provide items? That is, what is your turnaround time? And will that time be the same for copies versus loans? What will your loan period be? And will you accept renewals? When supplying physical items to others, how will you ship them? Do you use a statewide courier or regional courier? Do you use a commercial shipping service? Do you use the US Postal Service? And why? So to me, we lend because we borrow, and we lend to encourage others to lend. So in interlibrary loan, reciprocity and generosity are very key values. And I have what I have dubbed the golden rule of interlibrary loan, and that is lend unto others as you would have them lend unto you. And then finally, that how much question. So how much will you charge others to borrow materials from you, if anything? And will that amount be the same for copies as it is for loans? Will it differ based on memberships and consortia and groups? And then again, how will you facilitate collection of those payments? Next slide, please. So the process, again, very simply, so first of all, we receive that request from the requesting library in some way, and then we verify that citation, and we're verifying our own holdings to see if that's something that we can actually supply from our collections. If need be, we'll retrieve a physical item and package it, and then we'll supply that item to the library. And then in the case of loans or returnables, once that item has been returned to us successfully, we'll actually close out that request. So the most immediate connections to other departments are cataloging and electronic resources, because holdings accuracy is such an important piece of lending operations. So a current catalog inventory is key to facilitating lending work. Likewise, electronic resources holdings have to be up to date. And licensing terms should also be reviewed for interlibrary loan language to ensure compliance, because those licenses trump any copyright laws that may be in place. Next slide, please. So document delivery, I define as where the library serves as both the borrower and the lender. So in that case, the process combines aspects of both borrowing and lending. But document delivery often entails some special purchasing considerations. So will a requested book be filled by purchasing the title and adding it to the library's permanent collections? Will you offer article purchasing to your patrons or your users to help them obtain needed materials quickly? What systems will you use to facilitate all of that? How will those be configured? And what amount of money are you willing to commit to offering that type of service? And because document delivery includes aspects of both borrowing and lending, and then some, it intersects with the same departments that we've already talked about, and some additional departments, such as acquisitions. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the systems that are most commonly used to facilitate interlibrary loan work. So first of all are some OCLC supported systems, World Share Interlibrary Loan, TAPASA, Iliad, and then some that are not affiliated with OCLC. So Clio is one system that many libraries use. And then you have these other standalone systems and networks like Rapid ILL and DocLine, and some international systems to consider as well, like Relay and D2D. And so some of these systems interoperate with the others. So for example, Rapid ILL and Iliad. And in my experience, there seems to be an add-on or a plugin or whatever you want to call it for just about anything and everything for Iliad. And so Iliad has positioned itself well in terms of that interoperability. Next slide, please. And so finally, these are some of the most pressing, I think, issues and trends and topics within interlibrary loan work currently. And in fact, several of these are presented on at this year's conference. And so you can learn more about these issues in other sessions. And so ebook lending kind of thus far has been really limited for most of us to simply kind of supplying copies of chapters, if that's permitted within our licensing terms. And so lending copies of entire ebooks can be somewhat cumbersome, and it may require additional systems, and licenses oftentimes have to be negotiated to allow and permit whole ebook lending. So it's certainly an area of innovation and exploration. Controlled digital lending is also one of those hot topics. And so effectively facilitating controlled digital lending is our present challenge. And a lot of interlibrary loan vendors are aware of this. And so they're seeking out ways that they can help facilitate that particular process as well. And then as with everything and anything these days, the costs of interlibrary loan systems that we use are rising as well. And so folks are exploring some open solutions to facilitate that work, including Project Reshare. And with that, I will pass it over to Kirsten.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Williams, and I'm the Resource Sharing and Cataloging Librarian at the University of Southern Indiana's David L. Rice Library. I'm in Evansville, Indiana. I've worked in interlibrary loan here at Rice Library for over 11 years, and most of that time actually as library staff. And in fact, I've only been a librarian for about 6 months, so I'm very much a newbie in this role. Next slide, please. For many years, our interlibrary loan unit consisted of a librarian that kind of oversaw the unit in addition to their other duties, one interlibrary loan staff employee and one ILL student employee. The ILL staff employee was responsible for the day-to-day operations, customer service, student worker supervision, and any kind of special projects. And for much of my time here, I was that person. However, our ILL unit has undergone a lot of changes over the years, and it looks significantly different now than from what it did even just 3 years ago. So we started out in reference, but we are now located in our resource management unit, formerly technical services. And I am now the resource sharing librarian. So I oversee all of interlibrary loan. We have one full-time dedicated ILL staff employee, and she is the ILL point person in our library. In addition to processing requests, she deals with customer service issues, handles the overdues, answers questions, and of course also works on special projects. We have 2 non-ILL staff backups trained to process ILL requests and can fill in whatever needed. They may deal with customer service, but mostly they're just there to keep our services running. Our backups do work in the resource management unit, so we're all physically located in the same space. And finally, we have one student worker who works for the whole unit, not just ILL, and that person typically handles a portion of our lending operation. We are not a large operation. We average about 6,000 requests yearly. Our workload can actually be handled by one person plus just one backup. But as you can see, we have many people trained in interlibrary loan, and there are several reasons for that. The first and probably the most obvious is that interlibrary loan is a mission critical service in our library. Our users rely on our interlibrary loan services, and we need to be able to provide continuous quality service. We cannot have ILL staff be out for a week and there be no coverage. That's just not acceptable in our library. But at the same time, ILL staff should be able to be out for a week, even if it's the busiest week of the year. And they shouldn't have to worry about ILO coverage. So by cross-training non-ILO staff, we can provide our ILO service no matter what gets thrown our way. And also, no one has to stress about taking a day off or trying to get everything done when things get crazy. There is always someone that can help. And these are the 2 main reasons why we cross-train, but there's a lot of benefits to cross-training generally. From the literature, we know that cross-training positively affects the library, our users, and our staff. It provides new opportunities and skills for staff whose work may have disappeared due to just the way the library has changed. Cross-training, it decreases the chance of burnout, it improves morale, it encourages communication, and it creates a sense of shared responsibility. And I have found this to be true, all of this to be true in our experience with cross-training in my library. So now that you understand why we cross-train, I want to turn to just 3 strategies that we have used to successfully train and bring non-ILL staff into our ILL operation. So the first thing you should do before training non-ILL staff, or any staff really for that matter, is create detailed documentation. It is vital that our backups can keep our ILL services running if the main ILL person and myself are out. They are trained one-on-one with me, but they have access to this documentation that has all of our workflows. Creating this documentation, of course, is very time consuming, but it's essential to keeping our services running. I recommend housing this documentation online and in one location. Since our library uses LibGuides, that's what I have used to create our ILL unit manual. It's a private document, but it's accessible to anyone that has a link, and everyone that processes ILL has this link bookmarked, and they refer to it anytime they need it. And as you can see here, this is a snip of our LibGuide, and it's very extensive, and a lot of these tabs have pages nestled underneath them as well. And it didn't always look like this. Our documentation has gone through many, many iterations, and this is thanks to the feedback I get from those that use it. And this would be my advice to those creating documentation for interlibrary loan, especially if you're creating it for people coming from outside of ILL, is to ask for their feedback. I ask for feedback, and I feel that it makes the documentation stronger. I've clarified instructions, I've changed wording, provided definitions, added tabs, I've moved things around, all based on feedback, because I want this document to work for the people that are using it. In fact, my ILL backups will often ask me to add the weird issues that only seem to come up, of course, when nobody is around. And because of that, I have created, as you can see here, a tab called Weird Iliad Issues and How to Fix Them. And so I just keep adding things to the guide as needed. The next strategy may be a little unconventional, but it works well for us. And that is our ILL backups have 1 day a week to process ILL requests. So currently one works on Wednesdays and the other on Fridays. And we do this for 2 reasons. One is that it allows them to encounter a variety of scenarios that can arise in the ILL unit. You, of course, can try to train on every type of request or situation, but that's a lot of information to throw at a person learning a process for the first time. Even if you have good documentation, you can't cover every scenario. And sometimes you have to make a judgment call. And if you're the only one, and if you're only processing ILL, say once every few months, you may never really get the experience to feel comfortable making those types of decisions. So by having our ILL backups do ILL once a week, it allows them to get comfortable with Iliad and with our workflows and feel confident in making judgment calls should they need to. We also do this to give our primary ILL person time to work on other things. She is also cross-trained in other duties and has other ILL work that she needs time to work on. And as we all know, ILL can be unpredictable, and a bunch of requests coming in completely derail your plans to get something done. So this gives her time to really focus on other tasks. And this has worked out well. I feel that our backups could keep our ILL services running for weeks if necessary. They are comfortable with Iliad and our workflows because they are engaged with it every week. So that leads to my third strategy, which is to encourage communication and collaboration among your backups and your staff. Going from 2 people to 4 people was initially a communications challenge, especially for me. It was sometimes difficult to ensure everyone had all the information. If somebody asked a question and I answered it, I needed to be sure that everybody knew what the question was and the answer, and not just one person. So my solution to this was to create a group chat in Microsoft Teams. This is a tool that we started using during the pandemic, but we mostly just used it one-on-one. So I created an interlibrary loan team with everybody that works on ILL and encourage them to, if they're comfortable, to send their questions and provide information here rather than coming directly to one person. So that way everyone can see the question and the answer, but they can also chime in with their own experience or their thoughts. And the chat logs are saved. So if somebody remembers a question, but maybe they don't remember the answer, they can just do a keyword search and find it in the log. So in addition to being a great communications tool, Our group chat, I feel, has fostered a collaborative environment among all of us that work with Interlibrary Loan. I often go here and ask for feedback or suggestions. We use it to coordinate coverage or ask for help when needed. And I have found that this online collaboration carries over into in person as well. And it truly does make us feel like a team. It is a shared responsibility. So in conclusion, I just want to encourage everyone to advocate for themselves and for their staff. For years, it never occurred to me to ask for a backup, let alone two backups. It wasn't until my director and my boss more generally were promoting cross-training in our library that I had a bit of a light bulb moment about the positive impact this would have on our services and our staff. And this has proved to be true. All it took was someone broaching the idea to change how we do things in our unit, and we completely changed it, and it's had such a positive impact. And that is all I have. I will pass the baton on to Kristen.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm Kristen Burkholder. I'm the Access Services Librarian at Oklahoma City University, obviously in Oklahoma City. And I'm going to talk about how we kind of fell into cross-training here at the Delaney Brown Library. So I was a historian before I became a librarian, so I'm going to go through this kind of chronologically today. In 2011, there were 2 part-time staff in Interlibrary Loan. One of them did mostly borrowing and the other did the lending. There was 1 student worker who assisted with some of this stuff. In the late part of that year, the lending person was transferred to become the circulation supervisor of our student workers, but still helped with lending. But the experienced borrowing person ended up doing a lot of both things. I was hired in March of 2012 as the Access Services Librarian. And while I was also doing a lot of other stuff, I learned the borrowing techniques from our experienced borrowing person so that I could help out. And I made a lot of use of OCLC's training offerings to learn more, because our library is open almost 100 hours a week, and so my schedule did not coincide terribly well with the schedule of the borrowing person. So while I could ask questions of that person when I needed to, I also wanted to make sure that I had gotten all the details that maybe we hadn't run into or hadn't had time to talk about yet. Next slide, please. Thanks. In 2013, we were finally able to hire a new person to do the ILL lending in the middle of that year, so in summer. And so our experienced borrowing person trained our new person, cross-trained them on borrowing so that they could do that as backup, because of course people get sick, take vacation, all this kind of good thing. In 2014, our borrowing person died unexpectedly, failed to show up at work. And when we did a check on them, they were no longer with us. So it was tragic and unexpected. And what we ended up doing was promoting our lending person, who had been there for about a year at that point and had previously been a student assistant in ILL at another institution. We promoted that person to borrowing, and then were able to hire a new lending person fairly quickly. From 2014 to 2018, then we had the 1 primary borrowing person, another primary lending person, but each of them could do the other's tasks if needed. Our circulation supervisor continued as backup lending and also learned some of the basics of borrowing, and I continued as the backup borrowing person. And this notes our schedules. So the 2 ILL folks had Sunday to Thursday schedules. I have a Monday through Friday, and the circ supervisor is Tuesday through Saturday. So mostly the ILL folks did all their stuff Sunday through Thursday. I generally covered borrowing on Friday, and our circ supervisor did borrowing on Saturday and lending if there was time to do that. We also shifted to using OCLC's WorldShare ILL at that point. Previously, we had been using First Search and also had used Odyssey to send and receive articles. And again, you know, OCLC provided training, we used that training. Why reinvent the wheel? If you have something available to help you learn something, that's often the best way to do it. In 2018, once again, we lost our lending person. I should perhaps note that the way that we are structured is that the borrowing person is generally considered the more senior person, has more responsibility. The student worker tends to work primarily for borrowing rather than lending. But we were fortunate enough to hire a new person pretty quickly. And so our by now quite experienced borrowing person trained our new lender. And we continued using the OCLC training resources to refresh knowledge, learn about the new enhancements that they kept coming up with. In 2020, COVID-19, our library closed for over 2 months and there was very little physical access. When we did reopen the building in a limited way to primarily staff, we had staff furloughs for 14 weeks, and our lending staff member was among those who were furloughed for that time. Our borrowing person remained on the payroll, but the work was almost entirely remote for that 2-month period of closure and then the furlough period as well. So we were able to do stuff with articles. We could not do lending of physical materials pretty much. And physical material lending was the large part, remains the large part of what we lend. We borrow articles, we lend books and videos and music. Since libraries across the country, of course, were in pretty much the same situation, the volume of interlibrary loan went way down during this period, and really one person could handle it without too much trouble. The hardest part was getting remote access to our servers, and we had to coordinate with our campus IT folks in order to be able to do things. Next slide, please. So by 2021, we were pretty much completely back to campus. We have been seeing a lower volume of interlibrary loan requests compared to the pre-pandemic. And then our lending person left in August. It always seems to be the lending people who leave the fastest. We were able to hire somebody in December, and again, our experienced borrowing person trained them. And that person left in May after almost 9 years, but luckily we were able to have that person overlap and do some remote training of the replacement. And still the same circulation supervisor and the same librarian and me are backup for borrowing and lending as well. So next slide, please. So before I got here, there was a kind of quick and dirty document for emergency coverage if our staff were out or something. Between 2012 and 2014, we didn't really create any new documentation, but there were 4 folks who had overlapping knowledge of the procedures, either both borrowing and lending or good knowledge of one or the other. It was in 2014 that we really started doing deliberate cross-training. We did mostly use the OCLC training, but we also started working on documentation for our local lending procedures. Next slide. In 2018, when we were hiring a new person, I updated the lending procedures document, and that was primarily me who did it because we didn't know that our lending person was leaving until they were gone. And so I went in and worked on that, did everything myself and sort of practiced as I was updating. And then again, updated lending procedures for our new hire in 2021. In 2022, when our long-term borrowing person was leaving, we had sufficient advance notice. And since they had agreed to do training virtually and remotely, we were finally able to do good documentation of our borrowing procedures. So that has been really helpful with our new person. Next slide. We have 2 locally created databases that we use to track requests, one for borrowing and one for lending. They do add extra steps, but they help us track some things that we might not be able to get out of OCLC. This also makes documenting challenging. There are a whole lot of if the patron wants X or the lending library does Y, then we do this other thing. So that made documenting it really hard. The best way that we found to do it was to actually type up what we were doing as we were doing it, do lots of screenshots, and then have another staff person try to follow the instructions and clarify or correct as needed. So similar to the kind of feedback that Kirsten was talking about. Next slide. And the benefits of all this. We have been able to continue ILL even when somebody goes on vacation, is out sick, resigns unexpectedly, or dies unexpectedly. And it was extra helpful when we had COVID-19. We lost somebody to furlough for 3 months. We had to do everything remotely, and there were enough folks who knew how to do the things that we were able to adjust with reasonable ease, all things considered. Cross-training also lets people keep developing new skills, which allows the job to be a little more interesting. And we are a small library. There is not a whole lot of room for promotion. Within ILL, it's like, well, you can go from lending to borrowing maybe, but that's about it. But you can still show those skills on a resume if you're moving on. So that is one of the benefits of cross-training, is you have a broader base of skills that you can demonstrate to a new employer, excuse me. Next slide, and that was it.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your tips and tricks and methods for cross-training and introductions into interlibrary loan. We do have quite a few questions in the Q&A. One question that kind of came up in the chat was, does anyone else use Slack? Or does everyone on the panel primarily use like Microsoft Teams or maybe Google Chat, other methods of communication?
We just use Teams. That's because that's what we have at our library.
Okay.
Our documentation is in Word documents primarily, which are accessible to everybody through SharePoint. We don't really use Slack. We do, it's a small library. No one is more than literally about 30 seconds walk from anybody else, even though we actually have desks in different areas. So we often can ask in person, since we have overlapping shifts. If you're not there at the time that somebody needs to ask you, then we do email. So we're not that media friendly.
And yourself, Rusty?
So we also use LibChat, since you have that internal chat that you can use for staff. And so we've used that as well to facilitate those conversations.
Great. And one question that came up for Kirsten, is there any chance you might be able to provide a link to your LIB guide that you have? I know you mentioned it's private, so I'm not sure how that would work.
It is private. I'm not sure, just because there's some detailed documentation as for workflows. There might even be some login information, but I could definitely look through everything and also check with my boss, and I might be able to share it. I just wouldn't be able to do it today.
Great. And at that point, we'll make sure to integrate it with the slides and into the handout. And another question that came in, do you cross-train all your backups on both borrowing and lending, or do you have, say, 2 staff who cover just borrowing and 1 who covers just lending?
My 2 backups they do both borrowing and lending and document delivery, and basically all of interlibrary loan. They are trained in all of it.
Okay.
And I'd mentioned that my student worker is trained just in lending, because borrowing tends to get to be a bit more complex with some purchasing decisions and document delivery issues. And so students are trained only in lending, but then my adjunct librarian, because he has greater knowledge of library operations, he does both borrowing and lending.
Mm-hmm.
And here, ideally, everybody eventually learns how to do both, but it can take quite a while. So I, for example, mostly just did borrowing for a couple of years, and it wasn't really until we were again short of a lending person and our really long-term experience borrowing person wasn't around, that I started to learn how to do lending as well.
And then another question we have is, how have you all kind of navigated identifying or soliciting staff to cross-train in ILL?
Whoever is doing ILL eventually gets, either borrowing or lending eventually gets cross-trained to do the other half. And beyond that, the person who had done lending and became the search supervisor just sort of picked up the borrowing as well. And I learned because I wanted to, and we don't really have other staff who have time to learn to be backup. With 4 people, that seems like enough for us.
It's been a while since I think it was initially asked about it, but then it's been a bit more organic in that my director, anytime a position opens up, will maybe rewrite the position, or we're always kind of evaluating roles and departments. And so when there's an opportunity to train somebody in interlibrary loan, of course, they're asked if they want to do it. And then we do it then. So I've not had to like put out a call. It's come organically. My last backup moved from circulation to our unit. And she had an interest in interlibrary loan. And so it was an easy, fit to just have her trained, and that's how we've done it.
Right. My part-time librarian position, one of the duties was interlibrary loan and providing support in that. And then in terms of identifying students, that's really just a totally different process altogether. It's more just kind of making those connections with students and kind of seeing who has the right skill set and the aptitude to engage in that type of work, especially when it relates to being detail-oriented and being familiar with using resources and locating materials. So again, just back to that idea of persistence. So which students kind of display that trait naturally, and really just through daily interactions with them, using those moments to identify students that would be well suited to training in interlibrary loan.
Great. And then kind of piggybacking off of this, have any of you had an issue or concerns or heard concerns from staff who are getting cross-trained regarding job security? Like, have any of those people whose jobs it is to partake in IOL, but then learning about others getting cross-trained, about anyone feeling that job security issue?
No, we haven't had that come up as an issue. Partly because we have not all that many staff. We're open 98.5 hours a week, and we want 2 staff here all the time. So, we have kind of a minimum number of people that we can have in order just to be able to physically do that. So there isn't really any concern about job security in that sense. And cross-training just means, maybe you have something that you can do if your other tasks are slow on a day when there aren't very many people here.
Any other thoughts on Kristen or Dusty? Have you guys had any experience with this?
Can you repeat that?
Just general job security insecurities with your staff due to cross-training?
No, I mean, my staff, my main ILL person welcomes it because she likes to do a variety of different things. So it gives her a chance to get a break. And I have been the person that has joked about, I always have job security because I'm the main person that does interlibrary loan, and it's stressful to be that person. So that's not an issue we have at all.
And I think really kind of speaking to the benefits of cross-training might help to alleviate some of those concerns when it's placed within the framework of, you're serving as a backup. This is not necessarily your job all the time. That this just allows someone to take a much needed break. It allows you to diversify your skill set. I mean, it's not a situation that I face here in my context, but if it were to come up, I think that would be my approach, is to kind of play up the positives of the benefits of cross-training.
I think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
I was going to say, I think a lot of people outside of interlibrary loan don't necessarily realize how you have to constantly stay on top of things and how your whole week can be derailed if you just have a ton of requests. And so I think when you get that across, I think that helps as well.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. That is the end of our time. We still have a couple of Q&As in our queue. I'll be sure to get those questions to our presenters so they can give us their feedback. That's the end of session number 2. In the chat, you'll see a link to our Google form for feedback. Please take some time to go ahead and fill that out so our presenters and the NWILL committee can learn from your experience. Thank you so much, everyone.